since the mid-1990s, the primary force that has pushed the US and Iran away from each other diplomatically and towards a military confrontation has been the pressure from Israel and the pressure from groups within the United States that are very sympathetic to the Israeli perspective. And so when Obama opted to go for diplomacy and eventually got a deal, what he was fighting when he was trying to get that deal through Congress was nothing else but those groups that were very close to Netanyahu's line of thinking in the United States. And of course, Netanyahu himself came to the US Congress in an unprecedented move and spoke against the American president from the US Congress, which has just simply never happened before. So there's no hiding any longer, or it hasn't been for the last 10, 15 years, that Israel is the key force.
Salamat everyone. You are listening to Red Inverted Triangle. This show is about the ongoing struggle for liberation in Palestine, produced on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like Palestine, Australia is a ground zero of a genocide that has been occurring for over 200 years and continues to this day. From the river to the sea, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Ahmed. I am a Palestinian living on this stolen land, and I'll be your host. This podcast aims to provide the Palestinian story, Palestinian narrative. It's necessary because we live in a heavily indoctrinated society where, as Palestinians, being able to speak, to tell our stories, and narrate is the ultimate form of resistance. That's right, resistance, hence the name of our show, Red Inverted Triangle. Each week, we'll be bringing you different segments, such as news updates from Palestine, Palestinian music, interviews with Palestinian figures or non-Palestinian figures talking about Palestine, and everything else related to Palestine. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. This episode of Red Inverted Triangle, we are bringing you a conversation I've had with Dr. Trita Parsi. Dr. Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. He is an award-winning author, authoring 4 books on the US foreign policy in the Middle East, with a particular focus on Iran and Israel. Parsi's latest book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, reveals the behind-the-scenes story to the nuclear deal with Iran. Trita is an expert on US-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign policy, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He has been named by the Washingtonian Magazine as one of the 25 most influential voices on foreign policy in Washington, D.C. for 5 years in a row since 2021, and preeminent public intellectual Noam Chomsky calls Parsi one of the most distinguished scholars on Iran. I hope you'll find my conversation with Trita Parsi useful and productive. Enjoy. Dr. Trita Parsi, what an absolute pleasure and honor. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Trita, I want to start by asking you briefly, if you could, just to lay out the historical context of the relationship between Iran and the US. And by the US, I really mean also the West, including Australia, because in general, I'd like to think that our foreign policy as Australia is tightly connected to that of the American empire, if you will. But also, as you point out this historical relationship, could you also help us understand what has Israel's influence on that relationship been like?
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much for having me. US-Iran relations, or the phase essentially that we have been in since 1979, have of course been one of tremendous enmity and tensions. Prior to that, though, the US and Iran were close allies. The United States did a coup in Iran in 1953 together with the Brits, in which they got rid of the democratically elected prime minister. Iran at the time was an embryonic parliamentary democracy, and reinstated the Shah as the sole ruler of the country. He reigned for another 25 years after that, and those 25 years ended up being the most brutal and more repressive ones of the Shah's reign. And the revolution happened in 1979, and it didn't initially intend to become anti-American, but nevertheless, it did after students stormed the US embassy, demanding that the US would extradite the Shah and bring him back to Iran, where he should stand trial, according to the students. Ever since, we've seen this tremendously negative trajectory. The only pause in all of that was the years of Obama, in which he pursued genuine diplomacy, managed to reach a genuine compromise between the US, Iran, and several other states on its nuclear program, a deal that was working perfectly fine up until Trump in 2018 decided to withdraw from it. And since then, we've been on a negative trajectory again, which culminated, of course, in the attack of Trump on Iran's nuclear facilities in June of this year. But for the last 30 years, since 1992, around that time, Israel ended up becoming a very negative force in the sense of seeking to prevent any opening between the US and Iran. Whereas prior to that, Israel had actually been the country that had pushed the United States to talk to Iran, to sell arms to Iran, and not even pay attention to Iran's anti-Israeli rhetoric because it wasn't reflective of Iran's actual policy. The reason for that is that prior to the revolution, during the time of the Shah, Iran and Israel were allies. They were allies because they faced common threats: the threat of the Soviet Union and the threat of certain pan-Arab states that both the Iranians and the Israelis had a problem with. From the Israeli standpoint, that relationship they thought was a very eternal one, essentially. They felt that Iran's problems with the Arab states ran as deep as Israel's, and as a result, they were natural allies that would always be allies. That was not the perspective of the Shah. He pursued that relationship with Israel, but once he was in a position of strength and he could make peace with the Arab states from that position, that's what he opted for. And you saw a significant warming of relations between Iran and Egypt in the 1970s. And the warmer he became, the closer he went towards the Arab states, the more questioning and the more, not tense, but nevertheless, it wasn't any longer that strategic alliance between Iran and Israel. After the revolution, however, the geopolitical situation in the region became such that the Iranians actually had greater need for Israel because Iran's entire military was based on American weaponry. Iran was the third largest importer of American weapons back in the 1970s. Once the revolution happened, the United States imposed an arms embargo on Iran, including on spare parts, which completely grounded the entire Iranian military. There were two countries at the time that had access to American spare parts and had the willingness to sell those to Iran. One was North Vietnam, who had it because of the Vietnam War, of course, and the other one was Israel. And the Israelis were doing quite a lot in terms of selling weapons to Iran throughout all of this, the 1980s, because from their standpoint, if Saddam Hussein had won the Iran-Iraq War, he would have then turned his attention towards Israel. So the Israelis did not want to see Saddam winning that war. And so despite the fact that the Iranians under the new Islamic regime now were taking a very anti-Israeli position, the Israelis nevertheless helped Iran in that war because it would have been worse for them if Saddam had won. Come the early 1990s, however, the geopolitical situation changes dramatically. Iraq is defeated by the United States and the UN coalition. The Soviet Union collapses, which then means that the two strategic imperatives that had brought Iran and Israel closer together, which was the threat from the Soviet Union and the threat from states such as Iraq under Saddam, they were now gone. And the new constellation of the region was such that the Israelis increasingly started to view Iran as the new potential threat, as a rival rather than a partner. And since then, the Israelis just completely flipped. and started pressuring the United States to sanction Iran, to not sell arms to Iran, of course, not even talk to Iran. They were completely opposed to any diplomacy, and they were certainly opposed to any deal that could bring the US and Iran closer together, which is the exact opposite position that they had in the 1980s, in which, again, with the same regime, even with Khomeini alive, far more radical in the 80s than it was in the 90s and 2000. At that moment, the Israelis were actually pushing for a dialogue and a realignment between the United States and Iran. Now, as part of this new effort to prevent the US and Iran from striking a deal, having a dialogue, the Netanyahu government was dead set against the JCPOA, dead set against the nuclear talks, and eventually won because Netanyahu managed to convince Trump to pull out of the deal, and eventually also managed to convince Trump to take military action against Iran earlier this summer. And that is after more than 20 years that the Israelis had persistently pushed the US to take military action against Iran.
So that seemingly obvious animosity between Iran and the US, I don't want to get into how those nations feel towards each other, but that kind of seemingly obvious animosity, can we say that it's largely due to Israel's views of Iran in that region and its potential hegemonic power and dominance?
It's not only because of that. I mean, there were periods in which the Israelis actually were in favor of a rapprochement between the US and Iran, and the US was against it, and the Iranians were against it. But since the mid-1990s, the primary force that has pushed the US and Iran away from each other diplomatically and towards a military confrontation has been the pressure from Israel and the pressure from groups within the United States that are very sympathetic to the Israeli perspective. And so when Obama opted to go for diplomacy and eventually got a deal, what he was fighting when he was trying to get that deal through Congress was nothing else but those groups that were very close to Netanyahu's line of thinking in the United States. And of course, Netanyahu himself came to the US Congress in an unprecedented move and spoke against the American president from the US Congress, which has just simply never happened before. So there's no hiding any longer, or it hasn't been for the last 10, 15 years, that Israel is the key force. But it's not always been. And there's been periods in which there were other imperatives on the US side that didn't want to have a deal with Iran, and the same thing on the Iranian side, whereas the Israelis actually wanted the Iranians and the Americans to come together.
I mean, we always hear all these kind of statements and rhetorics in the West, the likes of Iran is the biggest existential threat of the state of Israel. Basically, it's all regurgitating Israelis' talking points. So to that end, the Iranian regime, I don't prefer to use that expression, but that's the rhetoric. The Iranian regime's support of designated terrorist organizations in the region, the likes of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis, has been viewed as a serious threat to the stability of the entire region, not just to Israel. So what is the end goal of Iran in supporting all these resistance movements around the region? And, is Iran actually an existential threat to the state of Israel in that respect?
Iran is not an existential threat to Israel, according to Israeli officials themselves. There's a very important thing to make a distinction here. The Israeli government has, for more than 2-3 decades now, had a line in which they called Iran an existential threat. But when you scratch the surface and you hear what the Israelis are saying internally, you certainly have some people who are saying that, but you have 3 heads of the Mossad in a row who said that Iran is not an existential threat. The former Prime Minister of Israel and Defense Minister Ehud Barak has been saying since the mid-1990s that Iran is not an existential threat. And part of his motivation is to call Iran an existential threat is to diminish Israel's own power. Now, is Iran a challenge to Israel? Iran is a threat to Israel. Israel is a threat to Iran. Existential is a completely different matter. However, if you want to get the United States to take military action against Iran, if you want all other Western states, including Australia and other states, that are aligned with the West to take on a very tough position against Iran, then yes, there are certain things you need to say to make sure that it shapes the thinking of these countries about Iran. So if you say that Iran is an irrational state, that Iran is a suicidal state, and that it constitutes an existential threat, what have you achieved? Well, first of all, if Iran is irrational and suicidal, it means that neither diplomacy nor deterrence works. You're only left with taking preemptive military action. So since that has been the objective, the narrative from the Israeli side has been Iran is existential, Iran is suicidal. If Iran is suicidal, why does it constantly refuse to commit suicide? If Iran is irrational, why did it manage to go from the defeat of the war with Iraq, or at least to the complete devastation of the country in that war, to become one of the most powerful countries in the region, at least up until recently? That is not the track record of an irrational state that at the same time is suicidal. So these statements have nothing to do with the actual reality, but they have everything to do with what is the policy objective of the Israeli state. Well, the policy objective has been to get the United States to take military action against Iran in order to achieve a balance of power in the region that is far more favorable for Israel, but that Israel on its own cannot achieve. In order to get that, then you have to go out with these narratives of existential threats. And again, I want to emphasize, it doesn't mean that it isn't a threat. Existential is a different story. Take a look at how the Europeans are talking about Russia as being an existential threat to Europe. Now, Russia certainly has that capability because of its nuclear weapons. But if it really is an existential threat, and if it really is an existential importance for Europe that Ukraine wins that war, then why aren't there any European troops fighting for Ukraine? So there's a mismatch between the threat level that is being presented and what the threat level that they're actually acting upon, both in the European case and in the Israeli case. And again, that's not to say that Russia is not a threat. It's not to say that Russia did not illegally invade Ukraine. But we have to really scratch the surface and recognize that governments oftentimes use a very exaggerated rhetoric, not because it's true, but because it's helpful to lead other states towards a policy option that they prefer.
Now, if that's the end goal of Israel, to maintain balance of power in the region, then wouldn't
It's
you
not a
think—
balance of power. It's not maintaining it. What the Israelis are looking for is complete military domination of the region. The Israeli security doctrine is such. Most states, not all states, essentially say that a threat is essentially the combination of capability times intent. So just having the capability doesn't make you a threat. You also have to have the intent. In the Israeli case, they're not looking at intent. They're assuming that intent to destroy Israel is always there. It's constant. So the only thing they're looking at is capability. If that's your approach, the only way you're safe is that you have to have the capability of outgunning everyone in the region and every combination of states in the region all at the same time. This is the core for what the Israelis call the strategic military edge that they need to have in the region. It's actually written into American law. The United States cannot sell weapons to Saudi Arabia that are on par with what they're selling to the Israelis. So that entire doctrine has already been written into American law. So what the Israelis are looking for is not some sort of a balance. Balance is exactly what they're against. They're looking for domination of the region, just as much as right now they can bomb Gaza, they can bomb Lebanon, they can bomb Syria at will with impunity without American involvement. That's what they're requiring for the rest of the region, particularly if there are states in the region that have the capability of posing a challenge to Israel's domination.
So pretty much what they're after in Iran is to reduce Iran to something similar to Syria.
Absolutely. That was the point with the 12-day war. I'm not of the view that the Israelis thought that they would succeed in one go. But clearly, from their standpoint, the job is not finished. The effectiveness of Iran's missiles proved to be far greater than the Israelis had anticipated. The Iranians produce missiles faster than the Israelis and the Americans produce missile interceptors. The cost, of course, is completely different as well. So there's a long way for the Israelis to be able to actually achieve that, but that is the objective. This is also part of the reason why the goal that they did achieve with that attack, which was to finally get the US into the war, was nevertheless only a half success. They got the US into it, but the US was only in for it for one day, one attack, one strike against the nuclear facilities, and then out. Whereas the Israelis were hoping that the US would come in fully and support Israel by partaking in the attack against a whole set of different military targets inside of Iran.
Right. So the end goal is not really to terminate the nuclear capability. It's its dominance in the region and to reduce Iran to similar to Syria. The more you talk, the more questions I get. So behind this end goal as well, like why Iran? What's so special about Iran? I just want to talk about the Palestinian context. Wouldn't you say that the main reason why Iran is a target of Israel is because its support of these resistance movement, Hamas and the likes, and so on and so forth?
Yes and no. The fact that Iran has been supporting Hamas, but frankly, it's been supporting Islamic Jihad much more so than Hamas. And of course, been supporting Hezbollah, and the relationship with Hezbollah is much, much closer than it is with Hamas, is definitely a problem from the Israeli side. But even if it wasn't, the Israelis would still not tolerate that Iran would be able to have the capability of challenging Israeli dominance. I mean, look what happened as soon as the Israelis thought that they at least had achieved quite a lot with Iran. And what we saw what happened when the regime in Syria, Assad regime, fell. And the Turks really rose in power. Immediately, the Israeli media started talking about how Turkey is the new threat. Now, the Turks had not been supporting Hezbollah. The Turks had not done a lot of these different things that the Iranians had done, but they have the capability. And as a result, the very same narrative that we suddenly saw in Israel in late 1991, when for the first time, 10 years after the Islamic Revolution, they started to talk about Iran as a potential threat. That immediately happened in Israel as soon as Assad fell and the Turks were essentially a rising power in the region. So I think it certainly isn't helpful. It certainly has contributed the perception of threat for the Israelis to see the massive investment the Iranians have made in the acts of resistance, etc. But I think it is a little bit false to believe that that's how this whole thing started. And had the Iranians only not done this, everything would have been fine between Iran and Israel. That is what you would get when you take a look at it at a surface level, without a doubt. That's the easiest conclusion to reach. But when you scratch the surface and you see a whole different realities, the fact that at the height of Iran's support for Hezbollah, the Israelis were lobbying the United States to actually provide Iran with advanced military means, then you see that there is a more complex reality behind the scenes that you really need to take into account.
Absolutely. I'm trying to contrast that with Israel's relationship to Saudi Arabia, for example. So they chose diplomacy and normalization with Saudi Arabia. Maybe the difference between the two is kind of the Palestinian element, wouldn't you say?
No, the difference is that Saudi Arabia doesn't have any capacity whatsoever to really pose a military threat towards Israel because the entire weaponry of Saudi Arabia is American. Uh, Saudi doesn't have much of an ability to be able to project power in the first place. We saw that it failed in Yemen. So in that sense, it's very, very different. And they also know, of course, that without the support of the United States for Saudi Arabia, the entire security of the Saudi regime, at least up until recently, has been a huge question mark. So when you have pliant states, to use that word, or who are bound to the United States, such as Egypt, such as Jordan, etc., then you have to first recognize they don't have the capability, but beyond just not having the physical capability, they don't have the political capability to pose that challenge to Israel.
You say that the objectives of the 12 days war between Israel and Iran, the objectives has not been achieved. Are you predicting that? Because I heard you once say that there is kind of an inevitable aggression between the two countries coming up soon. Why do you assume that?
I wouldn't say that it's inevitable, but I would say that there's a very high risk that this war will start off again, because once the Israelis started this campaign, which from their standpoint is going to be a long mowing the grass type of a strategy. They don't think that they will achieve this objective in one or two goes. But once you started this mowing the grass strategy that they themselves call it, then you cannot afford to stop. Because if you stop or you give too long of a pause, it provides the Iranians in this case enough time to be able to rebuild their air defense systems, perhaps buy better ones, to root out the Mossad presence in the country, build more missiles, figure out better how to penetrate Israel's air defense systems, etc., etc. And then suddenly the window to be able to strike them again at a relatively low cost closes. So given that, I think the Israelis have a clear interest based on how they're defining their strategies to attack again. But of course, it depends on many different factors. Can they do it without a green light from the United States? Can they do it without making sure that the US is ready to defend them against the retaliatory missiles that the Iranians will shoot at them? Can they do it given all other kinds of challenges that they're faced with, logistical problems, all of these different things? I mean, towards the end of the 12-day war, they were running out of Arrow 3 interceptors. Are they going to start the war without having replenished that? How long does that take, etc.? There's a lot of different factors involved in this. But if they had the capacity today to do so, I think it would be almost above 90% risk that they would start it. Now, they know, of course, that the Iranians are likely not going to play the long game in the next war. The previous war, the Iranians thought it was going to be a long war. So they actually they were careful with the number of missiles that they shot. They hoarded a lot of them because they thought it was going to be a war of attrition and that perseverance is going to be key. In the next war, I think the Iranians are going to strike Israel at a much larger scale from the very beginning in order to completely dispel the Israelis from any idea, any notion that Iran can be turned into the next Syria, to the next Lebanon. And I think the Israelis understand that that is a high likelihood that the way the Iranians will react. So there's a lot of preparation both sides need to do before they feel that they're ready for the next war. Can it be prevented? It absolutely can be prevented. It can be prevented more than anything else by the United States. And it all depends on whether the Trump administration makes that decision, whether they want to go down that path or not.
At the moment, it seems that the APAC has been successful in convincing Trump to do a U-turn from the beginning of his presidency. I think he kind of changed tack a bit. But I do want to also change tack and want to go to my final question, which is kind of to do with domestic affairs here in Australia about the designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, as a terrorist organization by Australia, and also the subsequent expulsion of the Iranian ambassador, making him the first high-ranking diplomat to be booted out of this country since, World War II. Just to give a context of this story, in August this year, the Director General of the Australian spy agency ASIO, Mike Burgess, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced that based on credible evidence, Iran orchestrated two anti-Semitic attacks on Australian soil: the October 2024 attack on Sydney's Lewis Continental Kitchen and the firebombing of the Adas Israel Synagogue in Melbourne in December 2024. That same month, and interestingly enough, the Times of Israel reported on Sky News story by Sherry Markson that, quote, a tip-off from Israeli intelligence assisted the ASIO during its investigation unraveling the Iran terror attacks. That was Sky News. Quote, now, until this moment, the ASIO failed to provide any substantial evidence to back those findings, and there's a lot of suspicions around this topic. Not much in the mainstream media, of course, but it's in the independent media here in Australia, like Michael West Media, Deep Cut, and the What and Why podcast, and so on and so forth. So given all the current escalation and the escalating situation between Israel and Iran and the American involvement, what do you make of all these decisions? I mean, I can't help but wondering, are we going to be seeing more escalation and mobilization of Western rhetoric against Iran in preparation of, what you just described, this looming aggression against Iran by Israel and the US?
I don't know the details of this case. I haven't followed it, but from a distance, I agree with you. It does look as if there was a calculated decision by the Australian government in which the recognition of Palestine, which got a lot of pushback from the Israelis, was then combined with something that the Israelis had asked for quite some time, which was put the IRGC on the terrorist list. And for them to be able to do so, they had to point to something. And as you said, so far there's not been any clear evidence that had been put forward that that actually had an Iranian involvement. So I think a degree of skepticism is warranted, at least until evidence is presented, of course. And if the evidence is there, well, perhaps the story is true. But in the absence of that, it is difficult to be convinced by this story. And particularly the timing of it, the fact that the Australian government recognized Palestine, and this, got very angry reactions from Israel. This seems to be like one of those cards that the Australian government played. And it also reflects something else. Had Iran been a powerful economic power, which it is no longer in any way, shape, or form because of the sanctions, this decision would have been much more difficult for the Australians to take, if this other impression that I said is actually true. But precisely because of years of sanctions have now disconnected Iran from much of the global economy. It's mainly trading with regional states, with Russia, China, and India, but very little with Western states, who all have gone along and adopted, or at least accepted, the American sanctions, the extraterritorial American sanctions. It means that the trade that existed before is no longer there, which means that the cost of breaking relations, kicking out the ambassador, is very low compared to what it would have been before. And I think that this is also a factor to take into account here. It's not necessarily part of a broader orchestration of a larger attack against Iran. It is more perhaps a reflection that it doesn't cost the Western states that much any longer to do these kind of breaks because they've already broken with Iran. I mean, 10 years ago, France had a tremendous amount of trade with Iran. Germany had the largest trade with Iran in Europe. But because of the adaptation of the sanctions and because the JCPOA never brought the European companies back into the Iranian market, it is relatively cost-free, if not entirely cost-free, for Western states to adopt a very negative position vis-a-vis Iran. And to be frank, the Iranian government is not really helping itself with many of the things that it's doing. Some of it that actually are taking place, with a lot of dual citizens being arrested and accused of spying on very flimsy evidence or no evidence at all. So there's a lot of negative things happening from both sides. But he also tells you that the less trade and interdependence exists, the easier it is to just escalate. And ultimately, that's bad for everyone.
Absolutely. As I say, the more you talk, the more questions pop up my head. I do want to get into the roles of China and Russia into the whole situation, but I am also conscious of your own time. So I really want to thank you for your brilliant insight.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. See you soon. You've been listening to The Palestinian Show, Red Inverted Triangle. If you'd like to learn more about Palestine, or if you'd like to get involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, please follow Palestine Justice Movement Sydney on Instagram or Facebook. And keep tuning in to Red Inverted Triangle. My name is Ahmed. I will see you next time.